Hello, young soul. I don't have many good memories from childhood. Most of them are blurred, as if time wanted to erase everything that happened before that day. The day my best friend, Jonas, disappeared. I don't know what's more terrifying, what happened or what I still feel when I think about that day. Jonas and I were always the bravest guys in our small village. We grew up together, fishing in the dark waters of the river and exploring the dense forests surrounding the village. That summer, we decided we would explore the old uninhabited island, an island we had always heard about but no one had ever dared to visit. We didn't know what awaited us there, but we knew it would be something grand, at the very least something worth it. It was a cloudy morning, the kind of day people avoid going outside, but for us, that only heightened our sense of adventure. The wind was strong, as if it were pushing us towards something that was already waiting. The fog was so thick we could barely see the horizon. The sea was calm, but there was something strange in the waters. Something we couldn't understand at the moment, but looking back, I know it was there, lurking, waiting for our arrival. We took the boat, a small motorboat we had restored, and headed toward the island. There was no sign of life anywhere. We saw no other boats, no fishermen, no movement at all. Just the two of us, isolated in the middle of the sea, surrounded by mist. As we approached the island, Jonas seemed more restless, gazing at the waters with a distant look, as if something were calling him. I, on the other hand, was excited, adrenaline coursing through my veins, ignoring the warning signs that were beginning to form in my chest. We anchored the boat near the rocky shore, intending to fish there, knowing that spot was known for being fruitful. I always thought the island had a strange aura, as if it had a presence of its own, something that was watching us. But even so, we pressed on, not thinking too much about it. Jonas and I cast our nets into the water, unaware that we were about to be pulled into a nightmare from which we couldn't wake. The first few minutes were calm. The sound of the wind, the rustling of the nets, and the murmuring of the sea were the only sounds filling the air. But soon something changed. A sense of urgency filled the atmosphere. The boat began to sway, but not because of the wind. Something else was happening. The water around the boat started to swirl strangely, as if being pulled down in spirals, as if something was trying to emerge from the depths. Jonas then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. He was pale, his eyes wide. Before I could ask what was happening, he shouted, "Look!" I turned quickly, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. The sea, right in front of us, was different. The waters were lighting, creating shapes that seemed unnatural. I saw something I can't properly describe, something that shouldn't exist, emerging from the water, a dark and enormous shadow that began to pull the boat toward it. The water around the boat seemed to be getting sucked in, as if a black hole was opening right beneath us. Before I could react, the boat was violently yanked backward. I tried to hold on to the edge, but my body was thrown to the side. Jonas was going into the water. I saw his fingers outstretched, trying to grab onto anything, but there was nothing. He screamed, a cry that still echoes in my mind, and then, as if swallowed by the waters, he vanished. I tried to pull him back, but the waters were too strong, stronger than anything I had ever seen. The sea seemed alive, as if it were taking Jonas for itself, to a place from which one cannot return. I stood there, longer than I should have, trying to understand what happened, until the tide suddenly calmed. When I looked at the boat, there were no traces of it left. Jonas was gone. And worst of all, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I returned to the village in shock, in panic, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. But no one believed me. They said I was delirious, that it must have been a current, or an accident. The police found nothing, no traces, no signs. Jonas had disappeared, and all that remained was the emptiness and silence of the sea. Every night since that day, I see Jonas in my nightmares. He is there, at the bottom of the sea, with wide eyes screaming for help. But there is nothing I can do. He is there, with something, or someone, pulling him into the depths, and he will never return. Now I can no longer look at the sea without feeling that it is watching me too. And when the fog rises, I hear the waters whispering, calling my name, as if the sea has never let me go. As if it knows that, sooner or later, it will come back to take me. After everything that happened with Jonas, I tried to move on, but you know how it is. There are certain events that don't let you be at peace, no matter how hard you try to escape. I spent months trying to drown the fear, trying to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of my mind. But as you must know, the human mind can be a very cruel prison when it cannot forget. For a while, everything seemed normal. I returned to my routine, or at least I did my best to. But things began to change when the fog returned to the village. I know you might think it's just the weather, but those who live here know. The fog in our village is not like the others. It comes suddenly, and when it arrives, there is no light that can dissolve it. It is dense, thick, as if everything is being swallowed by it. And it was on that kind of night that I began to see things. I was at home, trying to sleep, when the fog covered the village so suddenly that I had no time to prepare. I closed all the windows, locked the door, and tucked myself under the covers, trying to ignore the fact that I felt the presence of something. Something strange that was there with me, waiting for me to look. I heard the wind outside, the creaking of trees moving, but there was a sound in the midst of the fog, something that chilled my blood. It was laughter. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was human laughter, low and muffled, as if someone were out there, somewhere in the shadows. And then I heard the sound of footsteps, slowly approaching my door. I could almost feel the weight of the air around me, as if it were being compressed. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like someone was standing just on the other side of my door. My heart raced in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. I was frozen. That feeling of being watched, of someone knowing exactly where I was, completely paralyzed me. Then, without warning, the door opened. I heard the creak of the wood, a sound that felt more like a sigh. The fog poured into the room, cold and heavy, and I saw, for a brief moment, a shadow pass through the open door. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something shapeless. It was as if the fog had come to life, twisting, like an invisible entity taking advantage of the space. The presence in the air became almost palpable, as if it were tightening around my throat, trying to swallow me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe properly, until I heard, from the depths of the fog, a low, dragging whisper. "Did you forget about me?" It was Jonas's voice. But it wasn't his voice. The tone was wrong, distorted, as if it were being pulled away, as if it were being spoken by something that shouldn't exist. The fog seemed to swallow me. I felt a suffocating heat, as if I were being placed inside a tomb, without air. And then, the lights in the house went out, leaving me in total darkness. I heard heavy, ragged breathing, trying to control the panic, but somewhere in the house, I heard something moving. Something dragging itself, slowly, as if it were surrounding me. I tried to get up, but my vision began to fail, and the air grew thicker, denser. The smell, the same smell I had sensed on the island, was back. A smell of something soaked with rot. Something coming from the depths, something not of our world. It was then that I saw it. Right in the center of the room, a silhouette began to form, slowly, amidst the fog. It was a tall, blurred figure, but its presence was overwhelming, as if the house itself were being shaped by its will. The air turned cold, so frigid that I could see my breath coming out in white clouds. The being, I don't know what to call it, but I know what I saw, raised its hands, with long, twisted fingers like claws. And when it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was not human, but something that had been destroyed and then risen again from somewhere deep, far beyond our understanding. I saw Jonas, but he wasn't there. It was his body, but the skin was paler, the eyes empty. He was being manipulated like a puppet, moved by this thing, by this void. I don't know how long I stood there, watching, unable to move, but what terrified me the most was Jonas's gaze. He looked at me as if he recognized me, as if he knew who I was, but without a shred of humanity. And it was in that look that I saw everything. He was somehow pleading with me to let him go, but he was trapped there. Trapped in the same thing that was watching me, waiting, sensing, as if he was now part of it. Before I could react, the words whispered once more, dragged out, as if they were invading me. "You will join us. You will return to the depths." I almost lost my mind that night. The whispers, the fog, the figure in the room. And the most disturbing thing of all, when I looked out the window, I saw the sea. It was calm. But on the horizon there, where the water met the sky, I saw a shape. A huge silhouette, human but with distorted proportions, moving slowly toward the village. I could no longer breathe. I could no longer think. Everything was fading. Everything was becoming a blur, until finally, I blacked out. And when I woke up, what surrounded me was silence. Just the deepest silence. But something was different. The smell of decay, the presence. They were back. And now, I know that the question that haunts me the most is now why Jonas disappeared. But who will be next? The days following that night were a nightmare from which I could not awaken. I was physically present in the village, but my mind was completely shattered. What I saw, what I felt, that couldn't have been just a hallucination. It couldn't. I lived it. I was there. And the images still haunted me like a shadow. Every little noise, every movement out of place, made me think that the fog had returned, that it was all about to happen again. I tried to tell someone. It wasn't just desperation, no. I felt that I needed help, that someone stronger than me should know what was happening. But, as you can imagine, no one believed me. That feeling, that certainty I have that what I saw was real, was dismissed with a cynical smile, a look of compassion. People here have their own demons, their own beliefs and fears. But the idea that something like that could exist? They simply couldn't accept it. My friend Marcos, one of the few I trusted, was the only one who listened to me with a bit more seriousness. He knew I would never lie about something like that. He always invited me to go fishing, gave me advice, listened to my troubles, but that night, something in his eyes told me he wasn't immune to what I had witnessed either. He was the one who brought me something that only added weight to my soul. I found this at the dock, he said, handing me a piece of rotten, old wood, with dark marks as if it had been burned or dried by something much stronger than the sea. He held the piece of wood in his trembling hands and looked at me silently, as if trying to decipher the scene still echoing in his mind. I looked at the piece of wood. I didn't know what it was, but deep down in my soul, I knew it was important. More than I wanted to admit, it was as if he was handing me the key to something even greater, deeper, and darker. Something that had been lost at the bottom of the sea and was resurfacing. I touched the wood, and a cold sensation coursed through my body, as if I had touched something that should not be touched. It wasn't just the wood. It felt as if my entire soul was being dragged into an abyss with that simple gesture. This was with him. Marcos continued, his voice trailing off, as if courage was slipping away with each word. He lifted his eyes, and I saw that there was something more there, something that froze me inside. "It's not possible," he murmured. But I saw something, in the sea. That night, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The thing Marcos saw was the same kind of presence I had felt, the same sensation that something was watching us, that the darkness had a life of its own. He tried to tell me in detail, but his words failed him, as if his own mind was trying to forget what he had witnessed. But the story he told, it made me wish I hadn't heard it. He was returning from one of his many nighttime fishing trips when the fog once again took over the water. He had stayed longer than he should have, not realizing the intensity of the change in the weather. He recounted seeing a figure in the water, something human but distorted, a shadow that moved silently. It was a reflection, yet at the same time, it wasn't. As if the sea was imitating something that was no longer human, something that should have been forgotten. The shadow approached slowly, as if testing his presence, and then he heard the sound. A sound that, according to him, could never be described as anything natural. It was as if the sea was speaking, with layered voices, distorted, fused, as if the ocean itself was trying to swallow the world around him. Marcos said that, at that moment, he felt the presence of what could be a specter. Not just any figure, but a creature, an entity, a thing that had once been part of the sea, and now returned to reclaim what was its own. I saw something in the depths, something that wasn't a fish, nor a creature I knew. Marcos continued, his voice faltering. It wasn't natural. That's when he saw what was trapped in that piece of wood. He found a mark on the hull of an old boat, the boat Jonas used before he disappeared. And at the moment Marcos looked closer, the words began to make sense. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The image he conveyed to me was as clear as the dark water of that night. The sea was taking everyone back, but not peacefully. Not with the peace of death. Not with the quiet of the end. No. The sea was taking them back in a distorted way, with torture and pain. Since that night, the village hasn't been the same. I still see Marcos from time to time, but he's not the same anymore. The fear he carries in his gaze makes me feel as if I'm looking at a man trapped in his own mind. And the mist, it returned. It comes back every night, thick, dense, impenetrable. And now, every time it arrives, it's not just fear that consumes me, but a sense that everything we're living is merely a preparation for something greater, something deeper. The thing that terrifies me is not what I saw, but what I know is still to come. And I know that Marcos was the first. But who will be next? Who will get lost at sea? I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The truth is that fear has no end, and it drags on like a specter, slowly devouring us, until we no longer know where our sanity begins and where the terror that consumes us ends. I still remember the last conversation I had with Marcos. He told me more about what he saw that night, and his words were interspersed with uncontrollable panic. He had tried to leave, to escape that place, but something kept him trapped, something he couldn't describe. He was afraid of the sea, but what terrified him more was the feeling that something down there was calling to him, a force that seemed to draw him in with no escape. I can't leave. I know I can't, he said with wide eyes as if he were in a trance. I saw what happened to Jonas. He wasn't just pulled, he was called. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that. He seemed completely consumed by an obsession, as if he were losing his own identity. His words left me unsettled, but what happened next, that haunts me to this day. That night, the mist was thicker than ever. I knew I should stay indoors, but something urged me to go out. I don't know if it was curiosity or something deeper that was calling to me. When I reached the harbor, the place was deserted. There was no one around. There wasn't even a shadow of life. It was as if the world had stopped there, in a morbid silence, waiting for something. I approached Marcos's boat. He was nowhere to be found. I tried to call him, but there was no response. The water was calm, but strangely opaque, as if reflecting a sky that didn't exist. I crouched down and touched the hull of the boat, and it was at that moment that I saw him. It was a distorted reflection, a movement in the waters, something that seemed to be watching me. I felt a chill running down my spine. It was as if, at that instant, the sea had breathed. And then I saw the figure of Marcos, or what was left of him. He was standing at the bottom of the sea, but not in a human way. His form was distorted, as if the ocean had deformed him. He was there, his eyes fixed on me, but his expression was empty, devoid of life. His eyes were no longer his. What remained of Marcos was submerged in the water, but what disturbed me the most was that, looking at him, I realized he wasn't stuck at the bottom of the sea. He was being pulled down. Something was dragging him. Something invisible, but with an inhuman strength. I could hear his scream, not in words, but in a deep, guttural sound, as if the ocean itself were trying to swallow his soul. He slowly turned, bones cracking, and his eyes were filled with an indescribable terror. And then he began to sink. Slowly, as if the sea were welcoming him back, but not in peace. He was swallowed by the water, but before disappearing completely, he looked at me one last time. His expression was a mix of despair and understanding. He knew what awaited him. In that moment, I felt what he felt. I was no longer seeing the sea. I was seeing the darkness. Something deep and ancient, something that should never have been awakened. I saw Marcos's eyes, but they were no longer his. They belonged to something much older, much more sinister. He was doomed. When I finally managed to step away from the edge of the pier, my legs were trembling, my hands cold. But the most terrible of all was what happened next. The village began to change. People started to disappear one by one, without explanation. No one saw the sea as before. It had become a forbidden place, a place of horror. I tried to escape, to leave everything behind, but I knew that the mark of what happened to me would never leave me. The sea, that deep abyss, would never let me go. It had touched me, and I knew what else was to come. That night, when I lay in my bed, the fog enveloped me again. Only this time, it wasn't the fog from outside. It was the fog within my mind. And I saw what was coming. Those whom the sea took, they did not die. They never died. They are called, each one of them, to return to the water. They are the price to be paid for something that cannot be explained, something that exists in silence, waiting for the time to feed. And now it's my turn. Every time I look in the mirror, I see those eyes, those empty eyes of Marcos, reflected back at me. They are calling me. I feel that one day, the sea will come for me. No matter where I am, they always return. The sea always returns. And I can already hear the waves. Are you ready to face what the sea hides? The old fisherman, named Edson, told me this one Sunday afternoon, when the sun was beginning to hide behind the mountains, and the air still carried the weight of the humidity coming from the sea. He wasn't one for long conversations, but when he opened his mouth to talk about that night, something in his voice made me pay more attention than usual. "You'll think I'm crazy," he began, looking at the water with a distant expression, as if he were reliving what happened to him. "But I need to tell you, because this has never left my mind. Not even after so many years." Edson had been a fisherman for over 40 years, and throughout his life, he had always been used to seeing strange things at sea. The sea air he breathed, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, the silence of the early mornings. But that night, that was different. He cast his net as he always did, just after sunset, while the rest of the village was starting to fall asleep. The full moon reflected on the calm water, as if the night itself were watching him, waiting for something. "I have always been careful," he continued, his voice now lower. "I never cast the net without first looking closely, without feeling the tide. But that night, everything seemed right. The water was calm, the wind was still, even the sound of the waves seemed distant. I threw the net and let it drop. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be a normal catch." Edson paused, his eyes narrowing as if he were reliving the exact moment something alerted him. "When I pulled the net, it was torn. Not just torn, but with marks, bite marks. Something had bitten the net. And it wasn't a fish. It couldn't be. I didn't find anything unusual at the time. I thought it was some sea animal. I don't know, a shark or something else. But something bothered me. The net was empty, except for those marks. A strange smell was also in the air. Something metallic, like blood mixed with the salt of the sea," he found, looking at his calloused hands and the fingers that trembled slightly. Edson had never been one to show fear, but that night, he seemed different, as if something had marked him permanently. "I kept casting the net. I couldn't let fear take over. But then, things started to get worse." That pause left me tense. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt that what he was about to say would reach me in a way I couldn't comprehend. What made me go back to that area was doubt. I'm a fisherman, and even after so long, doubt always consumes me. So, I went back the next day with a new net. I cast and pulled, but the same thing happened. The bite marks, the same tears. Only this time, something else was strange. The net had less fish than usual. As if, somehow, the fish were being taken away. Something was stealing from me, but I saw nothing. Just the marks. Fear began to grow. Edson looked at the sea, as if waiting for the waves to bring him something, but nothing happened. He continued, his voice deeper now. "On the third night, I decided to watch. I stayed on the shore waiting. And that's when I saw it. I saw something I can't explain. Silhouettes, human shapes, beneath the water. They weren't swimming like fish. They moved as if they were walking along the bottom, trying to catch what I was fishing. They were like people, but they were more distorted. The moonlight reflected on them in a way that made them look like they were crawling, like shadows in the water. They approached my net, and what happened next was worse than I imagined. He shook his head, as if the mere act of talking about it disturbed him even more. His eyes widened, the voice that had once been strong now trembled. I could never fish there again. Never again. Edson stood up from where he was sitting and sighed, as if trying to understand what had happened was beyond the capacity of an ordinary man. He looked at me, and the expression on his face was that of someone who had lived a nightmare that could not be forgotten. I know what you're thinking, he said, with a forced smile. But if you go there, and if you look at the water at night, you'll understand. Don't go. Don't do it. The sea, it's hiding something that doesn't belong to this world. And with those words, he walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I stood there, with the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, and the feeling that something was truly lurking just beneath the water. Something that shouldn't be there. And the doubt that Edson had planted in me, haunted me more and more. What did he see in that water? What did he really find at the bottom of the sea? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. I couldn't get Edson's words out of my head. Those shadows beneath the water, those figures he swore had been human, yet somehow distorted. The image of them crawling on the seabed tormented me, a chill running down my spine every time I tried to think about it. But like anyone who had heard a story like this, curiosity grew inside me, stronger than the fear. I knew the way to that area, although the sea was not something I knew well. The fishing village where Edson lived was remote, inland, far from the big cities, surrounded by wild and inhospitable nature. The kind of place where you could spend years without seeing a soul, and where anything could happen without being noticed. The sound of the waves was constant, and the houses were simple, with clay roofs and small windows that seemed to gaze into nothingness. The first time I returned to that region, it was early in the morning. The sea was calm, but a smell of rotten fish seemed to linger in the air, a presence that didn't come from any boat, but from the ocean itself. The waves did not break on the beach. They simply dried slowly, as if they were part of something bigger, something that was hiding there. The area where Edson told me everything happened was a bit farther away. The net he used, the net that had been so mysteriously damaged, had been left on the sand, near a large rock, where the smell of the sea seemed even more intense, mixed with salt and a metallic odor that I still cannot describe to this day. I cast the net into the water, just as Edson had done so many times before me. The movement of the water felt strange, something out of place, as if the sea was waiting for something. When I pulled the net, I felt an unusual weight, as if something was resisting from the other side. As I took it out of the water, what I saw made me swallow hard. There were no fish, but there were marks. Bite marks, exactly as Edson had described. Tears in the net that could not have been made by any fish, no sea creature. The web of the net was destroyed, but the most unsettling were the marks. They were circular, as if something with a massive jaw had bitten and torn pieces away. But they were not random marks. They followed a pattern, as if someone was trying to catch something specific. I stared at the net for longer, trying to understand what was happening, when I noticed something even more disturbing. There were pieces of something there. It was not fish. They were fragments of something that looked organic, but it wasn't fish flesh. They looked like broken bones, and when I looked closer, I saw that they were fingers. Human fingers. Some still had bits of skin and nails, as if they had been ripped from a moving body. The feeling of dread hit me violently, almost as if the sea itself was calling me, as if something from within it knew I was there, watching. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. It was as if the water was pulling me, as if it were trying to make me see more. I knew I should leave, but the fear of not knowing what that was, of not discovering what was really happening, paralyzed me. At night, I decided to return. Perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of a curiosity I could no longer control. The sky was covered with clouds, and the wind was blowing hard. The moon was hidden, but the darkness felt even denser, as if the night itself wanted to hide from what was happening in that water. I stood in silence, watching the surface of the sea. The sound of the waves was still there, but now it sounded more heavy. The sea was not calm like before. The water seemed to move, as if something was stirring beneath it, yet there were no waves. It was as if an invisible force was distorting everything, altering the perception of time and space. And then I saw it. Not the silhouettes, but something even more disturbing. Something more real. There were figures. Human figures, as Edson had said, but they were not just crawling beneath the water. They were moving, rising from the water, emerging like shadows but with human shapes, bodies stretching and contorting in impossible ways. I could see their faces, distorted, pale, their eyes completely white, lifeless. But the most horrifying part was the movements. They didn't swim, they didn't move like living beings. They were more like puppets, bodies dragging themselves with a supernatural force, trying to rise, trying to escape the water. The most terrifying thing of all, however, was the feeling that they were watching me. I knew it was no longer just a simple vision, an illusion of the mind. They were there, at the bottom, yet their eyes seemed fixed on me. Their bodies, distorted, emerging from the water with movements that made the blood freeze in my veins. And when I tried to run away, it felt as if the sea itself was holding me back. The silence was broken only by the sound of the water, but the sensation of being watched, of being surrounded by something I couldn't understand, made me stop. I knew I shouldn't go back. Something there was waiting, watching, and it wouldn't be the last time it showed itself. I didn't know what Edson had seen, but I now knew he was right. That sea held something that didn't belong to our world. Something that could only be described as the shadow from the depths, watching and waiting for the right moment to emerge. When I returned home that night, something in me had already changed. It wasn't just the immediate fear of having seen those horrific figures rising from the depths of the sea. It was more than that. What tormented me was the fact that while I was there, watching those creatures, something in me had connected to the sea. It was as if I had been marked. As if I had been touched by something I couldn't understand, something that wasn't human. I knew I shouldn't go back. I knew my curiosity would destroy me, but there was something inside me, something visceral, that compelled me to return. And I went back. The next morning, when I arrived at the beach, everything seemed too quiet. The sea was calm, but there was a tension in the air, something palpable, as if the water knew what I had seen and was waiting for me. The sand was empty, except for the traces of the waves that the mud left behind, and the smell of rotten fish was stronger than ever. I walked to the spot where I had thrown the net, and as I looked at the water, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The water was dirty. Not with trash, not with seaweed or foam, but with something that seemed to be moving there, as if it was dragging itself on the surface, as if an invisible force was distorting the water, making it thick, opaque, as if the ocean itself was trying to hide something. As I got closer, something touched me. Not physically, but in the soul. It was as if the water was calling my name, as if the sea wanted me to look deeper, to see what was hidden there, beneath its waves. The sound of water dragging on the sand grew louder, as if it were breathing. As if the sea itself had life, and now I was breathing with frantic anxiety. I was hypnotized. I couldn't pull away. I leapt down, and what I saw took my breath away. In the water beneath the surface, there were marks. Marks that dragged across the seabed, but they weren't ordinary marks. They were like trails, as if something had been pulled through there, and the marks were deep, wide, more like the tracks of something large and heavy. And once again, something else caught my attention. It wasn't just the marks. It was the shape of the water, the ripples forming as if something was moving there, in the darkness below. I knew something was beneath me, waiting. And then, without me noticing the movement, the water opened up. The creature emerged from the depths, like a shadow dragging itself to the surface, something so large I could barely believe what I was seeing. It had no exact shape, but it was as if it were made of multiple distorted human forms, intertwined with the water. The skin, if it could be called skin, was covered in something like slime, dripping from the creature, and its body was wrapped in chains, as if it had been trapped at the bottom of the sea by something much older. And its eyes, its white, lifeless eyes were fixed on me, as if they had been watching me since the moment I arrived. The most disturbing thing, however, was the mouth. It was open, and I saw teeth, large and sharp, and the thing seemed to be trying to breathe, but not with human lungs. No. It was more like a vacuum forming, as if it were sucking the air from my soul. Those eyes, those teeth, were pulling me into the sea, as if they knew I shouldn't have looked, but now there was no turning back. I couldn't move. I couldn't pull away anymore. My feet were buried in the sand, and the creature was slowly approaching, dragging itself through the water, as if it were luring me in. I knew it was the end, but something made me glance to the sides, as if something else was nearby. And then I saw it. On the horizon, far away, more figures. More of those creatures emerging from the sea, dragging themselves to the shore, moving so slowly that it seemed time was distorting around them. They weren't fast, but they moved steadily, relentlessly. I knew I was no longer safe there. I knew that if I kept looking, I would be consumed by the water. So, with immense effort, I managed to move. My body was paralyzed with fear, but something inside me made me run. And I ran. I ran until my legs could take no more and I fell to the ground, feeling the cold night air engulf me. But I knew something was following me. I knew the creatures were watching me. I felt the eyes on me, and when I looked back, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I don't know what those things were, or what they wanted from me, but I know I can never return to that sea. I can no longer look at the water without feeling a chill running down my spine. Something is out there, waiting, and sooner or later, it will find me again. And you, who are listening to this, stay away from those waters. Don't look at the sea at night. Don't try to understand what lies there. Because I've seen what they want, and it's not what you imagine. The sea never forgives. I never thought I would tell this to anyone. What I saw, what I lived. I don't know if I can explain it all. I tried several times, but it's as if the words can't encompass the real horror of it. You know, when your mind is so filled with an image, a thought, that you start to doubt your own sanity. Well, that's exactly how I felt. I am a fisherman, and many years ago, when I was not yet so marked by time and the waters, I ventured on a journey that still haunts me today. It happened on an ordinary day, just another among so many I spent in the salty waters. But the way everything unfolded turned it into the turning point of my life. It was a cloudy morning. The sea was rougher than usual, but not enough to scare me. The sky seemed heavy, a mix of gray and a dirty blue, as if something was about to happen. But I didn't pay much attention. The tide was good for fishing, so I continued on my way, unhurried, as always. I was alone in my small boat, one of those old ones, made of rustic wood, the type any fisherman knows well, as if it were part of his own body. I sailed for a few hours. There was no one around, just the sound of the wind cutting through the sea and the creaking of the wood beneath my feet. The wind gradually picked up until, suddenly, a thick fog began to rise. At first, it was a light mist, which soon thickened and engulfed everything around me. Visibility dropped to almost zero in a matter of minutes. I no longer knew where I was. The sea seemed to be everywhere, as if it was swallowing me. I couldn't see anything but the dense white fog surrounding me. The boat seemed to stop working on its own, and I didn't know if I was moving or if the sea was dragging me to an unknown place. I paused for a moment, trying to listen for any sound, any signal, but all I could hear was the wind howling and the water lapping against the hull of my boat. I decided to wait. There was nothing else to do. I already knew that the fog could last for hours, even days, and that I wouldn't have much control over my direction. The best thing was to wait. But it was in that silence that something happened. Something that still gives me chills just to remember. I felt a pressure in the air. Something heavy, as if the very atmosphere were charged with oppressive tension. My muscles were tense, as if something was approaching. I stood there, motionless, waiting for the fog to dissipate. And that's when I heard it. A distant sound, faint, but unmistakable. A crack. A creaking of wood. I knew what it was. A boat. Or what remained of one. I stood up quickly, trying to look through the thick fog, but all I could see was the opaque white surrounding me. The sound grew louder, closer, I strained my ears, not knowing what to expect. The crackling now seemed like that of an old ship, moving slowly, with the wind pushing its sails, or what remained of them. But there was no visible boat. I revved the engine of my small boat, trying to escape those treacherous waters, but the sound wouldn't stop. On the contrary, it seemed to be coming directly toward me. The wind, now stronger, seemed to push the fog away from me, and it was at that moment that I saw it. At a reasonable distance, something emerged. A boat. It was huge, with torn sails, the wood aged and almost disintegrating, yet still floating. The boat was motionless, but its presence was undeniably real. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It couldn't be. What was that boat doing there? In the midst of that thick fog, with no one at the helm? Something was wrong. Something was completely out of place. But worse still, I saw something that made me freeze in place. There were movements inside the boat. Something, or someone was there, moving slowly, as if trying to remain hidden in the shadows of the vessel. I couldn't make out what it was, but there was life there. Something that, somehow, still breathed in that wrecked boat's skeleton. And there was a lit sail. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Curiosity, adrenaline, the certainty that something supernatural was happening took over me. I moved closer. Slowly, but without thinking much, I approached, unaware of how dangerous it was. The boat, which had been there, motionless, seemed to have emerged from another time, but it was so close now. So real. And it was when I was just a few meters away that, without warning, the boat disappeared into the fog. As if it had dissolved. There was nothing left. Just a mist, the silence, and the sound of the waves crashing against my hull. I didn't know what to think. I stood there for a while, searching, hoping the boat would return, but it didn't appear. When I finally decided to head back to the harbor, the fog had cleared, and I could see the horizon line. But when I reached the harbor, what I was told made me tremble. The boat I had seen, it had been missing for over 10 years. That's what my friend told me that night when, with wide eyes and a trembling voice, he recounted the story of his own journey. What he saw in that fog, and what happened when he returned home. I couldn't stop thinking about what he told me. When he spoke about the missing boat, something inside me shattered. I knew he wasn't lying. I knew somehow that what he had experienced was real. But the scariest part of the story, something he left out the first time, haunted me more than anything else. What he discovered after returning to the harbor. When he finally returned, the fog had already dissipated, but the feeling that something had unraveled along with it lingered with him. He still couldn't believe what he had seen, still trying to rationalize everything that had happened. But as the day dragged on, something deeply disturbed him. He felt, in an almost tangible way, that the missing boat was somehow connected to him, as if it had marked him. That feeling of oppression began to grow in his chest. The first thing he did upon arriving at the port was to look for someone who knew anything about that boat. He walked over to the old fisherman who always stayed by the dock, the man who seemed to know everything that happened at sea. "Did you see that boat?" was the simple question he asked, with the hesitant tone of someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it from someone else. The fisherman, with his white hair and skin wrinkled by salt and sun, looked at him with a vacant stare. He didn't seem surprised, just tired, as if he had been waiting for that question for a long time. "That boat disappeared over 10 years ago," he said, his voice hoarse and low, as if he were speaking about a ghost. "It hasn't been seen since. But if you saw it, you'd better start worrying." The fisherman didn't explain anything further, just turned and went into his house, leaving my friend alone, with the weight of that phrase echoing in his mind. If you saw it, you'd better start worrying. But that night, the real terror began. He slept poorly, his eyes snapping open at every strange sound from outside, and when he finally fell asleep, he had a horrible nightmare. The boat appeared to him again, but it wasn't the old, worn wooden boat he had seen before. No. Now it was intact, new, but with something much more sinister, a figure, a silhouette, in the center of the vessel. He couldn't see the face of that figure, but the silence was heavy with something deep and inexplicable. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The boat began to draw closer, until he finally heard a sigh, and the figure on the vessel slowly turned to him. and at the moment that creature's face revealed itself, he woke up with a stifled scream, his body sweating and cold with fear. But he wasn't just awake. He wasn't just in his bed. He knew, at that instant, that what he saw in that nightmare was not a dream. As he got up, he looked out the window of his house and saw, in the distance, what appeared to be a reflection on the sea. It was the silhouette of the boat again. But somehow, it seemed closer than ever. He felt a vertigo, as if the boundaries between dream and reality had dissolved. He ran to the dock again, desperate to see if he was imagining things, but upon arriving, he saw something he never imagined he would see. The boat was there. But not just a boat. There was a thin line of blood leading to it. The blood seemed to have been left by something, or someone. The water was wet around the hole, and he felt a chill run down his spine. The sails were lit, but not by any wind. Something was fueling the fire. And the figure. He saw, deep inside the vessel, the silhouette of someone. The same figure he had seen in the nightmare. He didn't have the courage to approach. He stood still, watching that boat in silence, the weight of darkness enveloping him. But then, the light of the candle in the vessel began to sway violently, as if an invisible wind was trying to extinguish it. The water around seemed to bubble, as if something was rising to the surface. The image of the figure inside the boat distorted, becoming more grotesque, until he finally managed to see the face. And that face. It was not human. It was twisted, as if melting, as if the flesh was merging with the water. The eyes were empty, but the eyelids moved, and the mouth was open, as if trying to say something he could not understand. But the most disturbing thing of all was the expression. It looked directly at him with a gaze full of despair and anguish, as if pleading, yet at the same time, challenging him to understand. It was at that moment that he heard a whisper in his mind. "Now you are part of this." He tried to pull away, but something was tugging at him, as if the waters were becoming thicker, stronger, as if the entire sea was coming to life. He could no longer breathe properly. He was being swallowed by something greater than himself. He saw the boat begin to move, as if no one were controlling it, and the fog that had disappeared hours before began to return. He ran to the dock stumbling, feeling his feet being sucked by the damp sand. When he finally reached his home, trembling with fear, the phone rang. It was a message. The message contained just one word: "Come back." And in that moment, he understood there was no escaping anymore. The fog, the boat, the figure, everything had intertwined, and now he was trapped within this macabre story, with no end. He looked out the window. The sea was calmer now. But in the distance, he saw the boat again, standing still, watching him. And the candle was lit, burning with an intensity that made the soul tremble. He tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that it was all just a series of coincidences, a nightmare that refused to fade away. But the message was the trigger. The comeback echoed in his mind like a macabre chant, something that pulled him with an invisible force, like a rope made of shadows. The idea that he had been marked by something beyond human understanding was terrifying, but it was the only explanation he could find for what was happening. That night, he couldn't sleep. He couldn't take his eyes off the window, where the sea seemed to pull him, call him, inviting him to return. Something inside him said he shouldn't. Something was warning him, but the fear of the unknown and curiosity made him unable to look away. He needed to understand. He had to know what was happening with that boat and the figure he had seen. He dressed quickly, not thinking much. The phone was still by his side, the screen illuminated by that haunting message. As he left his house, the wind felt strange. There was no rational explanation for the chill that cut his skin, as if the air around him was denser, heavier. The dock was deserted. There was no one around. The streetlights flickered, as if refusing to illuminate something they didn't want to show. The night was silent, but as he approached the water, the silence became more oppressive, as if the ocean itself was waiting for what he would do. When he arrived at the spot where the missing boat had been seen, everything was different. The sea, once calm and peaceful, was now agitated, with waves breaking closer than usual, as if pushed by some invisible force from within the water. He felt his throat tighten, but he forced his feet to move until he finally reached the edge of the dock. That's when he saw it. The figure was there again. The boat was no longer anchored, but floating on the water, held only by the sound of the current. The sails were lit again, but now the flame was unstable, flickering as if struggling against something he couldn't see. He could feel the presence of that thing, watching him, waiting for his reaction. He knew he shouldn't get closer, but his body seemed to ignore his brain. As if an invisible force was guiding his steps, he approached, 1 foot at a time, until he was practically in the water. The mist, once so absent, now enveloped everything around him, making the scene even more ghostly. He could barely see the horizon, and the only thing anchoring him to reality was the sound of the sea and the rustling of the wind in the sails. That's when he noticed it. The face. The figure, clearer than before, appeared before him. The face was distorted, as if being pulled out of a mask, flesh rotting. The eyes, still empty, were now speckled with something red, something that looked like blood, but didn't move. The smile. God, that smile was not human. It was too wide, limitless, stretched into a grotesque grimace. It didn't seem to be smiling at him but into him, as if it knew he had lost himself. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt dry. Fear rendered him unable to react. He could only watch, immersed in a chilling terror that consumed every cell of his body. And then, the boat began to move, not with the wind, but with its own motion, as if it were being pushed by something supernatural. It slowly receded, but something was wrong. The boat was not drifting away as it should. It was coming closer, with a terrifying speed, as if it were being pulled toward him. He stepped back and felt the water rising quickly, engulfing his feet, up to his ankles. He was still trying to process what was happening, but panic was overtaking every fiber of his being. That's when he heard a whisper. Not from the figure on the boat, but coming from within the water. He didn't know how, but he knew what it said: "Don't escape. You are already with us." The whisper came like a muffled scream underwater, and he felt a pressure in his chest, as if the sea were trying to snatch his breath away. When he looked back, the figure was closer, his eyes now fixed on him, filled with something deep and endless. He tried to pull away, but the sea felt thicker, and the boat was already within reach, its oars swinging on their own, cutting through the water with no one to control them. He tried to run, but something pulled him down, an invisible force, something like giant hands made of water and salt, that intertwined around his body. He sank, and the water swallowed his breath. He shot to the surface quickly, but looking toward the dock, he saw something that made him lose his sanity completely. He was no longer alone. The fisherman he had encountered at the port was there, but he didn't seem to be the same man. His face was pale, as if in decay, and his eyes were hollow, black as if the sea itself had taken his soul. The fisherman said, in a hoarse, dragged-out voice, "You are with them now." And before he could react, the sea pulled him down again. The water had already swallowed him completely. The cold was overwhelming. His body moved as if it were lifeless, as if he were no longer in control of his movements, but rather the current itself. He wanted to scream, but the water seeped into his mouth, swallowing every word. The whisper was still there, echoing in his ears, like a macabre and inescapable melody. "You are already with us." The face of the fisherman he had seen on the dock, now distorted and lifeless, appeared before him once more. His body was floating, but his eyes were empty, as if there was nothing left but the abyss. He wanted to look away, but something inside him forced him to gaze, as if it knew there was no escape anymore. He didn't know if he was dreaming, if this was still part of the fog that surrounded him, but everything felt so real, so alive. He could no longer see anything but darkness, the deep bottom that engulfed him. His legs were already weak, and he was sinking slowly, as if the water had a weight he could not bear. That was when he realized he was no longer alone. The boat, which had previously seemed lost in the mist, was there again, closer than ever. He could hear the oars moving, now no longer with the gentle sound of water, but with a frantic rhythm, as if something or someone was forcing the vessel to advance. A shadow of a person, a thin and distorted silhouette, appeared on the deck. Their movements were slow and heavy, yet they still possessed a chilling presence that made the air feel denser. He tried to fight, to reach the surface, but his strength was fading. The pale face of the fisherman returned, clearer than ever, now hovering over him, their mouth moving, but no words came out, only the sound of water flooding his lungs. The sea pulled him down again. He no longer knew what was real, whether he was awake or had been consumed by madness. But the terror did not cease. He was dragged deeper and deeper until, in a sudden and strange moment of clarity, he saw something. He saw the sunken boat, now completely submerged, yet with the sails still alight, as if the fire was fed by a greater force, something beyond comprehension. He saw the bodies inside, not dead, but trapped. Their eyes were open, fixed, staring at him. They were frozen in time, as if waiting to be freed or to take someone with them. The fisherman appeared again, but this time, he was no longer in the water. He stood beside him, at the bottom of the sea, his feet sunk in the sand. The ghastly smile was there again, as if looking directly into his soul. And then, he heard it. A familiar voice. It was his mother's voice calling for him. He heard her clearly, as if he were at home, in his bed, just waiting for her to wake him. The voice dragged through the waters, distorted, locked in something that made him doubt his own perception. Come back. Come home, my son. He looked around, seeing the bodies at the bottom of the sea, and for a moment, he was certain they were waiting for him, waiting to pull him to the place from which they would never return. It was not just a fisherman who was lost in that eternal mist. It was him now. He had already lost himself. He tried to move, but the currents grew stronger. He was being taken down deeper, until there was no more air, no more light, no more sound. The fog enveloped his mind, and the only thought left was a sense of finality. In a last desperate attempt to escape, he looked up toward the surface, hoping to find the light, hoping to find freedom. But what he saw was far worse. The boat was there, floating above him, now completely filled with the figures he had seen before, now no longer just watching. They were screaming. Their mouths were open, water spilling from them, but there was no sound. His eyes widened, and he could feel, even at the bottom of the sea, that they were looking at him. The last trace of his humanity faded away there, and everything went dark. When the fisherman's boat returned to the harbor, no one knew what had really happened. The fisherman was found, but alone, and his account made no sense. The man he had gone to find did not appear. The sea never told the truth. But in the harbor, something strange happened. The old fisherman's house, where everyone still spoke of the legends of the sea, began to fill with unexpected visitors. Some saw a man there, standing at the edge of the dock, looking at the horizon with empty eyes, waiting, as if the sea had something to return to him. They called the place the refuge of the lost, and say that sometimes, on very cold nights, if you listen closely to the wind, you can hear that call, still waiting for their return. Did you enjoy this story? Then don't forget to leave your like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the upcoming ones. If you've experienced something inexplicable or have a scary story to share, send it to us at the email in the description. Who knows, your story might appear here? We'll see you next time, if you're still here, if you dare.